and welcome to GameSack. You like my new Super Monkey Ball shirt? I like it. Anyway, it's time to check out some more arcade games and see how they ended up on home platforms. I've always been a fan of seeing what changes were made to any given game, even back at that time. Now, I'm not going to cover versions that were included in compilations or on Virtual Console or whatnot. Anyway, with that said, let's get to our first game. This is Airbuster from Canico, and it was released in 1990. In this 1 or 2 player horizontal shooter, you have only one basic weapon, but it can be powered up a whole bunch of times by collecting the flashing P icons. These are most often located in what I like to call the floating oil drums. Blast them open and power-ups fly out. There are also other power-ups that act as sub-weapons. I usually like these option-like things that increase my forward firepower, but there are others which do a few different things. Lastly, if you hold down the fire button for a few seconds, you'll begin flashing. Let go and you'll destroy all of the enemy projectiles on screen, as well as some of the weaker enemies. Usually your firepower feels a little wimpy, even when powered up, but the game is still fun to play. 2 of the 6 levels take place in space, complete with space physics. That means if you press a direction, you keep moving until you press another direction. This definitely adds to the challenge, but I kind of wish they had kept it confined to a single stage. The game can get crazy, as it's obviously designed to take as many quarters as possible, and it's always tempting to continue. The graphics are decent to good for an arcade game of the time without much in the way of special effects. The scrolling here in this video is a little herky-jerky because the game doesn't quite run at 60 Hz, but on a CRT it looks perfectly fine. The music is also pretty good, and the sound effects feature a lot of cool digitized effects. In 1992, Airbuster came to the Genesis, also from Canico. This version is a virtual carbon copy of the arcade game, right down to the 2-player simultaneous gameplay. The control here feels a touch smoother than the arcade, and thus it's slightly easier to navigate some of the tighter areas later in the game. It is a little easier on the default difficulty, but don't worry, it can still get insane in a few spots. The charge shot is now allocated to its very own button, so you can just keep your thumb held down on the rapid fire button for your regular shot, which is a welcome change. Otherwise, the gameplay is exactly the same. Well, except now it has actual loading time between each level. Also, you'll notice on the box a free offer for a Canico video glove. That's right, the offer was free. You had to pay shipping and handling. In fact, using this glove is guaranteed to increase your score by a minimum of 200 points, and I can report that it definitely works. You gotta be careful though, because this glove has not been tested with other games. The graphics in this one are pretty much just like the arcade. Some things might have a touch less color or be a little smaller, but all things considered, it's fairly close, especially considering the Genesis version is only 4 megabits. The music sounds good, and it's now in stereo, whereas the arcade was in mono. Unfortunately, all of the digitized sounds are now gone, but it still sounds okay. The TurboGrafx 16 version, known as Aero Blasters, came out in 1990, and it was developed by Interstate. It's also 4 megabits and 2-player simultaneous here. The game is much more difficult than the Genesis version, and maybe even tougher than the arcade game. Next, the game makes changes to the stages themselves. These are usually minor, such as a slightly different and more difficult layout to navigate through. Stage 2 doesn't warn you about the tunnel changes as you're speeding through it. This part late in the game now bounces up and down, which really screws things up. I mean, this section of the game is almost impossible not to spend a few continues on as it is, but no, they thought it wasn't difficult enough. It really messes with you. Even a few of the enemy attack patterns have been changed a bit. Interestingly, the space physics have also been adjusted. Here, you no longer float until you press a different direction. Instead, you just float for a very short time and then stop. Enemy projectiles tend to move a little faster in this version. When you die in this one, the game doesn't slowly recenter you to the screen and then push you back. You're given control almost right away. The graphics are missing some detail and things in the background are a lot smaller, especially in the first stage. I mean, the tall buildings that were in the other versions are now completely gone. The visuals here are still really impressive for the console though. Each level has parallax, some of it overlapping, making it look like there are two background fields. The last part of the final stage even has some interesting parallax effects when you move up and down that weren't in the arcade version. Not only that, but this is the only version of the game that has some actual ending graphics. The music sounds like a TurboGrafx game, and generally it's quite pleasant. What's interesting is that in Stage 2 they replaced a boring tune from the arcade and Genesis version with an exciting new piece which is exclusive to the console. Overall, both are good ports of a slightly above average arcade shooter. For the longest time, I used to prefer the TurboGrafx 16 version the most, mainly because it was the first version of the game I'd ever played. After playing and beating all three versions back to back tonight, I still think the Turbo version might be my favorite, just barely edging out the Genesis version, even though I don't like how they made this stage bob up and down for no good reason. This next game I didn't even know existed until I learned that it existed. It didn't see a wide release in the arcades, and the only home port it got stayed in Japan. Undercover Cops came to the arcades from IREM in 1992. This is a beat-em-up done by the same team that would eventually go on to make the Metal Slug games. You choose from 3 different undercover police officers known as city sweepers. 2 people can play at the same time. These cops aren't really good at being undercover as everyone, and I mean everyone, is after them. You have a punch and a jump button, but each character still has a few different moves. One of these is a special move that defeats enemies around you by pressing both buttons at the same time, but naturally this results in some of your life bar going away. Hey, it's not like you actually have to worry about wasting quarters anymore, so go ahead. The game puts absolutely tons of enemies on the screen, and it can often get overwhelming. Only the bosses have a life bar when you're fighting them. Sometimes there will be live animals running around that you can eat to restore your health, like frogs, chickens, and pigs. Heck, even giant living snails are delicious. There are even TV monitors with the first boss from R-Type for you to grab. You can pick up huge bars and posts to smash your enemies, which is pretty fun, but sometimes they're difficult to use since the enemies keep hitting you before you have a chance to swing them. This game can be rather annoying because they throw the same enemies at you again and again, over and over, all in a row. Of course, this raises the level of boredom that your brain is experiencing as you play. The gameplay isn't the smoothest beat-em-up ever, but it's still competent. Like 90+% of all beat-em-ups ever made, it starts getting boring around the 5th level. Well, good thing this game only has 5 levels, and that last one is pretty long. The graphics feature some nice pixel art, which this team would become known for. The sound and music are both pretty typical for an arcade game of the time. All in all, it's not an outstanding beat-em-up by any means, but it's worth a play or two. Three years later, in 1995, Undercover Cops came to the Super Famicom, only in Japan. This is a pretty faithful port. All of the characters are here, and so are their moves, though all of the names have been changed. Unfortunately, it's only single player now. Interestingly, the game feels much snappier and controllable compared to the arcade. As a result, it's less annoying to play, but make no mistake about it, it's still kind of annoying. In fact, it takes all of these motorcycles in Stage 4 and really ramps them up. You have to defeat about 600 of them. Well, okay, you don't actually need to beat 600, probably only like 470, but it feels like 600. While you still can press the attack and jump button simultaneously to do your special move, you can also enable the A button to do it with a single press, which is nice. I was also able to pull off this super special move, but I couldn't figure out how to do it consistently. In fact, I wasted more of my life bar trying to do it rather than focusing on the enemies that were there beating me up as I was failing. The game is a bit easier on the normal difficulty, but there are only 3 continues. There is a cheat to get 9 continues though, and well, that's what I used here, I'm not afraid to admit it. Graphically, the game doesn't look quite as good, even though everything is here. Even the little R-type monitors you can pick up are here. The screen is also letterboxed because, once again, drawing the whole screen is just asking way too much from the system. And no, it's not a stylistic choice, they just need to shorten the V-blank time as much as possible to concentrate on everything that's on the screen. There's less animation in both the backgrounds and the sprites, and it's also hard to see the DNA here from the team that made the arcade. I think I like the music here more than the arcade as it sounds more pleasant. The character voices are all mostly here and they sound perhaps a bit more muffled, but come on, it's reasonable. This is a 16 meg cartridge, and all things considered, I feel they did a pretty good job. Supposedly, they were planning for an international release, but obviously it didn't happen. Once again, this one is definitely worth a play, but make no mistake, it's not a criminally underrated game. Anyone remember Choplifter? Sega sure does. They made an awesome arcade version and an equally awesome Master System version. They weren't done though, as in 1992 they released Air Rescue in the arcades, which used a System 32 board. In this 3D game, your goal is exactly the same as Choplifter. Pilot your helicopter, rescue the hostages, and bring them back to the base. In each stage, you'll find tents, and here are where 4 of the very weird looking dudes are waiting to be rescued. You land and they run towards you and eventually board the copter. You can only hold 8 people at a time though, so once it's full, you need to fly back to the base, which is only a few hundred feet away at the maximum, and then drop them off. For each hostage that you successfully rescue, you'll get a sliver of fuel back. Also, as enemies shoot you, you'll lose some fuel. It's basically your damage meter. If you lose it all, you die and the game is over. The hostages don't die like they do in Choplifter though. Just pop in more quarters to continue and you're good, and so are they. You can fire a regular gun as well as some heat-seeking missiles, but you have to wait a few seconds before the missiles are ready to use again. You can use the map on the left to help you out, and each little white dot is a hostage that needs to be rescued. The crew is how many peeps you have in your chopper at any given time. The hostage number at the top of the screen is how many still need to be rescued, and the rescued number is how many you've flown back to the base. There are only 5 missions here, so it's super short. The graphics are really good for an arcade game in 1992, with lots of scaling everywhere. This is also one of those dual screen cabinet setups for whatever reason. Sega was really big into that. The game's sound and music both leave a lot to be desired, but the game is too short for it to become truly annoying. Overall, it's definitely a good one to pop a few quarters into. Air Rescue came home to the Master System only in the PAL region, also in 1992. Gotta be honest here, I'm noticing some differences compared to the arcade. If you look closely, you might see them too. The goal here is the same: go out and get the hostages and bring them back. This time your copter can only carry 4 passengers. Usually you don't need to rescue everyone in the stage, only your quota, which is similar to Choplifter. You can drop a ladder down for the hostages to climb. Sometimes they'll get in if you land, though other times they don't because they're idiots. Screw it, not rescuing you. When you're landed back at the base, you can change weapons. The top left one fires straight ahead, and the rest are basically all the exact same weapon, which kind of drops a bomb in a forward motion. The stages are weird. In stage 1, you're rescuing people from an amusement park. Why do they need to be rescued from an amusement park? Stage 2 is a burning building. As is typical in video games, people in the windows are dropping things on you in an attempt to kill you. Don't you want to be rescued? What the hell is wrong with you? Then in this stage, boats are sinking and are on fire, but guys are trying to shoot you down. Is a rescue helicopter pilot's death so important to you that you give up any hope for survival? No problem, I'll just kill him. Okay, these guys down here are tough to reach. Not only that, but they're impervious to my military-grade weaponry. This last stage is a complete bitch, mainly due to the very floaty controls and the very unforgiving collision. Like the arcade, there are only 5 stages. Graphically, it's okay for a late Master System game. The scrolling could be much smoother, especially given how little is happening on screen. It really chugs sometimes. The music is most definitely better than the arcade, despite it being piddly little Master System sound. When you put the two games side by side like this, you can see the difference. Sega probably didn't think we'd notice much. Both are short games, but the Master System one is more challenging. Still, you'll be done with it in no time. Although I'd rather play the arcade, I'd still rather play either version of Sega's Choplifter instead. I really like this next one as it was an early Genesis game in a time where there really wasn't a whole lot else to play on the console. Now it also has a lot of ports to British microcomputers that I can't cover because I can't even figure out how to get those things to run on Mister, but judging by the videos of these ports that I've seen, you're missing absolutely nothing. Anyway, there is still a lot to cover, so let's get to it. Here's Forgotten Worlds from Capcom, which came to the arcades in 1988. This is a rather unique shooter, which is a spiritual follow-up to their earlier game called Sidearms. In this 1- or 2-player game, you control a floating dude and his little pod. Both you and your pod can shoot. Your pod can also help block enemy projectile attacks. What's interesting about this game is that you can spin around 360 degrees. To accomplish this, the arcade machine had both a joystick to move as well as a spinner dial. Your pod will rotate around you if you spin without firing, and both you and the pod will rotate in place if you spin while firing. As you kill enemies, you collect coins called zenny. Sometimes a shop will pop up. You can spend your zenny in here to power up your weapons, get more life, shields, and whatnot. The game has 9 levels total, 3 of them with an Egyptian feel. You can even choose your route in the first 2 of these levels. Sometimes you're even flying straight up like a vertical shooter. Fortunately, you have a health meter because you'll be getting hit a lot. The graphics are excellent, as was the case with pretty much every game Capcom made for their CPS-1 setup, and this was the first game for that board. The music is great as well, but the sound effects totally overpower it. There are some voices during the cutscenes, but they're mixed pretty low.
If the war god really died, no doubt about it, the king of gods must be saying his prayers now.
This is definitely an interesting take on the shooter genre. The Genesis version of Forgotten Worlds was released in early 1990, ported by Sega themselves. This was my first experience with the game, and I thought it was pretty cool, though it did take a week or so to grow on me. The rotating is accomplished by firing with the B button, rotating clockwise with the C, and counterclockwise with A. It actually works pretty well, and I've never had any complaints with this control scheme. The 2-player gameplay is retained here. Unfortunately, 2 of the 9 levels have been cut from this 4 megabit cartridge. Level 6 here, which is a pretty short one, is gone, as is level 8 here. Not only that, but they seem to have swapped the bosses for levels 4 and 5 despite me taking the same paths in both versions. This game only offers 1 life and no continues unless you buy some in the store. But in the 2-player mode, you'll both have unlimited lives unless you both die simultaneously. So technically you can just keep switching controllers once your life gets low. If you try to play this one with a 6-button controller, you'll get a game over screen as stage 1 starts, so be sure to hold the mode button on both controllers when powering up your Genesis. The graphics see some severe cutbacks in size, detail, animation, and color. I thought it was all fine back in the day, but I'd never seen the arcade before, so I didn't know how much they had to scale it back to get it to fit on such a small cartridge. The music is now more audible and even in stereo, but the sound effects themselves are pretty sad. I used to love this version, but it hasn't aged tremendously well. Forgotten Worlds arrived on the Master System in 1991, ported by Sega and only released in PAL regions. It's not too horrible for a Master System game. You shoot automatically now and rotate with the 1 and 2 buttons. It works pretty well. Like the Genesis version, you only have 1 life and no continues. You think the Genesis version had lots of cuts, wait till you see this one. First off, this is a single-player game. Next, levels 4, 6, and 8 are missing. Levels 2 and 3 have been combined into a single level, as have levels 7 and 9. There's a brand new underwater level that's exclusive to this version. Here, you move really slow. You can buy a power-up in the shop to move a bit faster. Some of the graphics are pretty good on the console, and the music is, well, it's about what you'd expect. I guess if nothing else, it's better than the port of Strider to this same console. Forgotten Worlds came to the Turbo Duo in 1992, ported by NEC Avenue. The Turbo Duo, also known as the TurboGrafx 16 Super CD-ROM, also known as the PC Engine Duo, also known as the PC Engine Super CD-ROM. Using the unlimited storage space of CD, this one was able to be far more faithful to the arcade than the Genesis version. Unfortunately, it's single player only, but you can choose to play as either one of the two dudes when you start the game. Actually, there is kind of a dollar store 2-player mode in here. One of you can control the dude and the other controls the pod. Interestingly, you start out with 3 lives in this one, which basically means you have 2 reincarnation potions from the get-go, but you can always buy more. You also get 2 continues. You fire with the 2 button and rotate with the 1 button and the run button. Yeah, it's pretty weird, but you'll be fine after a level or 2. They even make a special 3-button controller if you want to use one. This one restores both of the levels that were missing from the Genesis version. However, stages 4 and 5 are both a bit shorter here, only being able to choose 1 path in each as opposed to 2 in the other versions. Lastly, the screen fades out at the end of each level to load the boss fight. The graphics are pretty awesome here, though still differ somewhat from the arcade here and there in terms of color and detail. The size of everything here is a lot bigger than the Genesis game, and it does result in some flicker. All the parallax scrolling has been removed, but still the game looks a lot nicer. The music is also played off of the CD, and the arrangements of these tunes is excellent. Quite a nice port of the game if I do say so, and I think I probably just did. Okay, just for fun, here's Forgotten Worlds on the Amiga from US Gold and ARC, only released in Europe in 1988 according to the title screen. Okay, both music and sound effects are on, let's go. And this version is a joke. You rotate if you press left or right while firing, but not up and down. The only way you can move left or right without spinning is by not firing. Oh, and the enemies in this game are bullet sponges. Keep in mind that the Amiga was just too good to have more than 1 button for most games. The designers of this one had never played a video game before, otherwise there's no way this one would have ever been released. It's a complete cash grab. I hope they didn't get any cash. Oh, and there are no sound effects even though I made sure both were on, remember? It turns out that if you change anything on the title screen, it doesn't tell you, it just says on. Still, this game can play only music or sound effects. The music isn't horrible, but come on, this is just sad. At least there's some parallax scrolling, but seriously, this game is just unplayable. There are other computer versions that I'm sure are even worse, but that's why I like sticking with consoles. Stuff like this always makes me extremely happy to be a console gamer. All in all, the Turbo CD version is by far the best port of the game. The beyond limitless power of the futuristic CD medium made this possible. I think I'd enjoy the Genesis version more than I do if I had never played the Turbo version, but it's still worth checking out. Alright, 2 more games to go and then I'll leave you alone. Well, actually, that's not true. I'm going to come back and babble for a bit and then maybe do a funny end sketch for you after the credits. Yeah, funny, that'll be a first. Here's SNK's 2020 Super Baseball, or Super Baseball 2020, whatever you prefer, released in 1991 on the Neo Geo hardware. It's the future year of 2020, and that of course means baseball has been improved with robots, cybernetics, and of course explosives. So basically, you hit a ball with a bat, and the other people try to get the ball and touch the base before you do. If you can touch all of the bases first, then you get a point. It's more fun to play than it sounds, and it sounds horrible. Anyway, since this is the future, sometimes explosives are put on the outfield. In the 3 or 4 times playing this game in my life, I don't think I've ever touched one either with the ball or with a player. The graphics are good, and of course the field is made of metal since, once again, this is the future and everything is made of metal. The sounds are great as well. I don't feel this is the best baseball game on the Neo Geo hardware, but it's still a great one, and it's the one that got ported to home consoles. In late 1991, Super Baseball 2020 arrived on the Genesis from Electronic Arts of all people. This is a pretty good conversion to a weaker system using 30 fewer megabits. Everything is here, just toned back. The gameplay is the same. Unfortunately, it only runs at 30 frames per second at its absolute maximum. I really can't comprehend why. This same developer also did Crew Ball as well as that horrid Tasmania on the Game Gear. So I don't think that smooth scrolling was even a concept that they were aware of. Otherwise though, this version is great. The graphics are certainly a bit muted compared to the arcade, and the scaling effects are all gone, but all of the voices are here, though they do sound a tad rough in comparison. If only they had someone who was better at coding to get 60 frames per second out of it. Also in late 1991, 2020 Super Baseball came to the Super NES from Trade West. This one doesn't try its best to be like the arcade. While the graphics are decently bright, there is less detail than the Genesis version. What's more is that this one barely has any voices at all. It's only 12 megs compared to the Genesis's 16, so some cutbacks had to be made. At least it scrolls at 60 frames per second though, with some slowdown here and there. Otherwise, it mostly plays the same. It's still a decent game of baseball, though I do think the Genesis version is a little better. There's a bit of Mode 7 scaling and rotation added that's different from the Neo Geo and Genesis versions. The Cyber Egg Stadium now scales and rotates instead of just scaling like the Neo Geo version. If you're gonna play a port and not the original, stick with the Genesis game. Still though, the Super NES version is not a bad game of future baseball. This is G-loc Air Battle, and it came to the arcades in 1990 from Sega. In this low-energy follow-up to Afterburner, your goal is to shoot down a small number of enemies in each short stage, and then move on to the next. You can choose from beginner, medium, and expert levels, each having their own game length and set of stages. In the beginner mode, all you have to worry about is shooting and flying. You can roll your plane the same way you could in Afterburner. If another plane comes up behind you, you exit the cockpit view in order to try to shake them off. Then back into the cockpit you go. The medium level lets you control your afterburners, so you can fly faster when an enemy is behind you. The expert level is the same, except now your roll is linear instead of requiring you to press a direction and then the opposite direction suddenly. Your plane doesn't snap back to being level with the horizon if you let go of the joystick. This allows for a bit more control during flight, and it makes it feel a touch more simulation-like. The biggest enemy in the game is your timer, which seems to be the only way you can actually lose a life and need to continue. Below you, a Mode 7-like ground scrolls slowly and it changes often. The graphics are actually quite excellent for their time, but still somehow less exciting than Afterburner. The music is good, but often stops playing, kind of reminding me of Virtua Racing, which would come later. Sega really seemed to go all in on this game, but I don't think arcade goers ever did.
Keep down. 7 enemies. Enemy!
G-loc came to the Genesis in 1992. This version was converted by Probe Software. It's similar to the arcade in that you need to shoot down a quota of enemies in each short stage. After every stage, you'll switch views. If you were in the cockpit, now you're going to move to the outside of the plane, and if you were outside, now you're moving back into the cockpit. You don't pop out anymore when enemy planes chase you, mainly because they never do. After a mission, you land back on the carrier and you can slightly upgrade your plane using your points. I really like the hand that's on the giant D-pad and buttons as you do this. The game never seems to end, and it appears that the timer is the only way to truly die. The graphics are pretty bad, almost Master System quality in some parts. The music isn't so hot either, which is really weird because usually Matt Furniss is pretty damn good. Honestly, it gets boring after about half an hour, which is where I just shut it off despite doing well in the game. Then there's G-loc on the Master System, which was only released in PAL regions in 1991. This was ported by Sega themselves. This one somehow manages to have a much higher energy level than the arcade and Genesis versions. As a result, it's actually a lot more fun to play. You still need to shoot down a certain number of enemies in most stages. You still get chased by enemies here, and it can get pretty nerve-wracking when that happens. It's still cool though. They even added boss fights to this one, just like they did in the Master System version of Afterburner. Believe it or not, these are pretty fun. The visuals are pretty good, except that your HUD takes up a gigantic portion of the screen. Also, as you can see, it is severely letterboxed. The music is your typical energetic Master System stuff. I had never played this one until now, and I was pleasantly surprised. The last port of G-loc showed up on the Game Gear, also in 1991. This was also ported by Sega themselves, albeit a different team there. Once again, the HUD takes up a very large portion of the screen. You now control an on-screen cursor, and after playing all of the other versions, this takes a bit of getting used to, especially the up and down motions. You can pick your stage as you go, but I recommend going from top left and working your way all around in a circle. That way you can upgrade your plane with better bullets, more missiles, and better armor, which you will absolutely need. I can't get very far in this one as it's quite easy to die, unlike the Genesis game. The graphics are okay for the handheld, and the music is typical for the Game Gear / Master System. There is the occasional stereo effect when a plane swoops in behind you. All in all, I think that out of all the G-locs, I prefer playing the Master System game the most. None of them are outstanding in any way, but at least that version is a little bit enjoyable. And there you go, 6 arcade games and their home ports. Out of all those, I feel that Airbuster was the most faithful to the original, though, like I said, I do slightly prefer the TurboGrafx 16 version. Also, Undercover Cops was pretty faithful. So what are some other interesting arcade ports that you're aware of? Are you going to stick around and watch the end sketch after the credits? I feel that most of you have probably already checked out, but for the rest of you, thank you for watching GameSack.
Sonic, I was able to hack in from my location to help. Just where do you think you're going? You're not prepared with the knowledge that you need to defeat Dr. Robotnik. Back you go. Hey, Sonic, I was able to hack in from my location to help you out in your battle to save the world from the evil Dr. Robotnik. I'll be able to send you items and power-ups from here. The world is in extreme danger, and we need to make sure Dr. Robotnik dies a horrible death. Go ahead and walk forward a little bit by pressing right on the D-pad. I've materialized 3 items I like to call rings. Collect them by pressing any button to jump. Now step ahead just a little bit and you'll see a box up there. Go ahead and get up there and jump on it. That'll give you 10 rings all at once. You want to collect all the rings that you can. Uh-oh, it's an evil monster. Watch out. As long as you have at least 1 ring, you're invincible. Recollect as many of these rings as you can and then jump on the monster to murder him forever. Remember to jump on the monsters and collect the rings. Alright, you're near the end of the stage. You have more than 50 rings, so jump into the big ring for a special chance to get a secret gem. Oh no! You're in a devious maze created by the evil Dr. Robotnik to trick and confuse you. Be sure to get the Chaos Emerald that's in here. Well, careful, jump now! That was close. Now break the barriers to get the emerald. You got the emerald. Be sure to get all 6 to make sure that Dr. Robotnik dies the most horrible death possible. Here's stage 2, and it looks just like stage 1. Remember the lessons that I taught you earlier. Collect the rings and jump on the monsters. Hooray! You cleared another stage. There's another emerald in here, so be sure to get it. Well, you didn't get the emerald, so now Dr. Robotnik won't suffer quite as much as he should. Another new stage that looks the same. I think you've got this. Go get him, Tiger. Hedgehog. Oh no! It's the evil Dr. Robotnik. He's come out to kill you personally. Fortunately, while you've been busy wreaking havoc running around the stage mindlessly, I've been busy coming up with a plan. You see how he's dropped the ball and is swinging back and forth? According to my calculations, you don't want to touch that or you'll lose all of your rings. And remember, you need to have at least 1 ring in order to survive getting hit, so it's best to avoid his swinging ball. Based on the evidence I have so far, he'll just keep floating up there back and forth until the timer reaches 10 minutes. What you want to do is jump up on one of the ledges and then jump off of that and then bounce on him. That'll damage him. Avoid the ball and go back and forth, and you want to keep doing this. He'll need 9 hits before he dies a horrible death forever. Looks like he got the hang of it. Keep doing that. Oh no! He ran away after only 8 hits. If only we could have gotten that 9th hit in. Fortunately, I've got the details on the location he fled to. Here's an apparatus created by the evil Dr. Robotnik to trap adorable animals. Go ahead and jump on top of it. Don't worry, my data here says that you should be safe doing this. Now we're at an entirely new area, and it's completely different. There are a few things you're going to need to know for this new area. For example, you're going to need to... Just where do you think you're going? You're not prepared with the knowledge that you need to